In a quiet corner of the world, hidden among the noise of everyday life, there was a man whose existence had begun to fade like the autumn leaves he once cherished. Samuel Whitaker was 82, his hands gnarled with age, and his hair, once as dark as the night, now turned silver. His home was a modest, old bungalow on the outskirts of town, a place where silence felt too heavy, and the emptiness of his heart echoed louder than the world outside. His wife, Eleanor, had passed 5 years ago, leaving a void that no one could fill, and with each passing day, Samuel felt more and more like a ghost in his own life. His children, long grown and scattered across the country, sent the occasional postcard or phone call, but those were fleeting moments, too brief to pierce the isolation that surrounded him. Yet, despite all of this, Samuel's soul still craved connection. He still yearned for a human touch, for something that would remind him he wasn't invisible. One crisp morning in late October, as the first frost kissed the edges of his windows, Samuel made a decision. It wasn't a grand revelation or a sudden burst of inspiration. It was, simply put, an instinct, the kind of instinct that comes when the heart is hungry for something more. He would start with small acts of kindness. Simple, random acts that required nothing but his willingness to engage with the world. In a world where people seem to rush past one another, too consumed with their own lives to notice the pain, the sorrow, and the joys of others, Samuel would do what he could. The first person he would touch wouldn't be his family or his old friends, those connections had become too distant, but rather, a stranger. Someone whose path he crossed on a regular basis, but whose life he never really noticed. And in that moment, a ripple would begin, though Samuel could never have known just how far it would spread. It started on a Wednesday, a day like any other. Samuel shuffled into the corner coffee shop near his home, a quaint little place that smelled of cinnamon and fresh coffee. As he ordered his usual, black coffee, no sugar, he glanced around at the faces that were always familiar yet distant. People were busy, typing on laptops, chatting with friends, or immersed in their own thoughts. The hum of the place created a kind of warmth, but it wasn't enough to penetrate Samuel's loneliness. As he waited for his coffee, his eyes landed on a young woman sitting by the window. Her brow was furrowed as she stared at her phone, her fingers tapping anxiously against the screen. He noticed the deep sigh that escaped her lips, the weight in her posture. She was clearly troubled, though she wore a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Without a second thought, Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill. He approached the counter and, without saying a word, placed the money down beside his coffee. "Could you use this to pay for her coffee, please?" he asked the barista. The barista looked at him, confused at first, then nodded. Samuel returned to his seat, watching as the young woman looked up in surprise when the barista told her drink was already paid for. She looked around the room, her eyes searching for the person who had done this small, inexplicable act of kindness. But Samuel, as always, remained invisible, sipping his coffee and pretending not to notice. The young woman's face softened as she thanked the barista and returned to her seat, her mood visibly lighter. Samuel couldn't know it, but this small gesture, his unspoken kindness, had sparked something inside her. She would never forget the mysterious stranger who had made her day just a little bit easier. It wasn't long before Samuel's small acts of kindness began to weave their way through the community. The next day, he bought a sandwich for a man sitting on a park bench, hunched over and looking as though he had no place to go. The man was taken aback, eyes wide in disbelief, before he stammered his thanks and smiled in a way that suggested the weight of his burdens had lightened, if only for a moment. On Friday, Samuel helped a mother struggling to carry a stroller up a flight of stairs. She had been juggling her child, groceries, and the stroller's heavy frame, but Samuel stepped forward without hesitation, offering his hands and his smile. "Don't worry, I've got it," he said, and with those simple words, the mother's heart lightened. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking with the exhaustion she had been hiding for days. The kindness didn't stop there. Samuel began to notice how little acts of generosity, no matter how small, could heal a person's spirit. One evening, he complimented a store clerk on her beautiful scarf. The woman blushed, her face brightening, and in return, she offered Samuel a free drink at the store. He took it without protest, savoring the moment of human connection. Each of Samuel's small acts seemed to create a chain reaction. People began to pass on kindness to others. The young woman in the coffee shop, who had been struggling with anxiety over her job search, decided to buy a cup of coffee for a homeless man she passed on her way home. The man, who had been living on the streets for years, looked up with astonishment when she offered him the hot drink. He was overwhelmed with gratitude and promised himself that he would do something kind in return, even if he didn't know how or when. The next day, a man who had received Samuel's assistance with his groceries paid for someone else's meal in a diner, unaware of the way his simple gesture would echo through the lives of others. As the weeks passed, the acts of kindness grew. The people Samuel had touched, however fleetingly, were now paying it forward in ways that he could never have imagined. The community, once disconnected, began to form bonds, unseen threads of connection stretching out and tying everyone together. Samuel, unaware of how deep the ripple had gone, continued his quiet mission of kindness. One cold afternoon in December, as the holiday season crept closer, Samuel received an invitation to a local charity event. The flyer, which had been pinned on the bulletin board at the coffee shop, read, "Join us for the Kindness Chain Gala, a night of giving." The event promised to celebrate the spirit of generosity that had spread throughout the town. Samuel was hesitant at first. He had never been the type to attend social gatherings, especially not one as extravagant as this. But something inside him pushed him to go, to see the result of his small actions. When he entered the venue, he was greeted by a sight that took his breath away. The room was filled with people, old and young, rich and poor, strangers and friends, who had come together to celebrate kindness. And there, standing at the center of it all, was the young woman from the coffee shop. She had organized the event, a celebration of everything Samuel had unknowingly started. "Thank you for inspiring us all," she said, her eyes bright with emotion as she approached him. "This entire evening is because of the kindness you showed me that day." Samuel blinked, unsure if he was hearing her right. What do you mean?" "The chain," she continued, gesturing to the room full of people. "It all started with you. Your one small act of kindness set off something we could never have predicted. And now, look at us. We're all here, together, celebrating the power of connection." As she spoke, Samuel's eyes scanned the room. The faces were familiar, people he had helped, or who had helped others, passing the kindness along in a never-ending chain. In that moment, Samuel realized that his small acts had become a movement, one that healed not only his loneliness but the hearts of so many others. It wasn't just about buying coffee or helping with groceries, it was about restoring faith in humanity, one person at a time. The evening continued, filled with laughter, shared stories, and generous hearts. Samuel, once isolated and lonely, found himself surrounded by people who cared, people whose lives he had touched in ways he could never have imagined. As the night came to a close, the guests gathered together for one final act of generosity. They stood in a circle, hands linked, and together, they made a promise to continue the chain of kindness, to spread love and compassion wherever they went. Samuel smiled, a quiet contentment settling over him. He had started with one small act, but the kindness had grown, and it had returned to him 1,000-fold. And so, the chain continued, an endless circle of giving, healing, and connection. All it took was one man, one moment of kindness, and a heart that was willing to reach out. In the end, Samuel Whitaker learned that even in a world that sometimes feels cold and disconnected, kindness has the power to warm it, one act, one person, one moment at a time.